Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the channel. I'm Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot of stuff to go on. I've got a bunch of things that I've put under kind of an intro, but they don't have a really good spot, and I want to spotlight them specifically to kind of go through some things. And some of them are pretty interesting, but some of them are a little bit personal here. So let's start off with this one who talks about bullying. And he says, I was bullied pretty badly in elementary school. My mom engaged in the process, which did not work. Independently, I discovered the solution, which turned out to be attacking my bully while he was seated and introducing his head to his desk over and over and over and over and over. And I bring this up because when we look at Vladimir Putin, we have what is effectively the ultimate bully. The bully armed with nukes. I mean, really, that's what we've got. But let me tell you a little bit about my story. Back in sixth grade, that was the 1 year I actually had to ride the bus to get to school. And during that time, well, there was a bully. Now, I'm a big guy. I've always been a big guy, but I've always been a peaceable guy. I don't try and find trouble. I don't seek out trouble. I don't want any part of trouble. That's just not who I am. But this guy had everybody cowed and basically willing to do whatever he said, even though he was a short, scrawny guy. He had something to prove, and he was going to beat up anybody between him and where he had to go. And he beat up plenty of kids. And after a while of him coming after me, it came to a head at the bus stop. Now, I'm not going to say that it was some amazing fight. In fact, it was pretty hilarious. He would charge at me with his head down and his fist flailing because he never expected anybody to actually challenge him as a bully. He never thought anybody would take that step. And so he didn't actually know how to fight. He knew how to beat people up who weren't resisting. And he'd come charging at me, and I'd step aside, and I'd just smack him in the back of the head. And did this one several times, just about exactly like that. He would be charging at me, and I'd slap him on the back of the head. And when the bus came, I said, that's it. We're done. We all got on the bus. And that day, his bully power was destroyed because somebody stood up to him. And, lots of people wanted me to beat him up again and fight some more. And I didn't want to fight anymore. I just didn't want to have any part of a bully. I just wanted to go to school and learn. It was one of the roughest years I had in school. There were a couple of times where literally he was trying to get together a group of guys to beat me up. And I managed to evade any particular consequences that time, with the assistance of actually my mother. And I'm not too proud to mention that, but, the bully's power was broken because somebody stopped him. Somebody put him in his place to remind him that the rest of us are human beings too. And while this might be schoolyard bullying, the same thing's happening at the global, the national scale over in Russia. Vladimir Putin is a bully. And Ukraine has made the horrendous sin of saying, no, you can't have it. You can't have our country. And now he's got to get all of his buds together and beat the snot out of Ukraine because they dared to challenge him. But if Ukraine can have that fight and kick him back out, it will destroy his power as a bully and end it. Now, he might come back again. In fact, I think it's likely he will after some time because there's some other things we'll talk about in a bit. But think about that. There's very few bullies that you can successfully kindness your way to helping to getting on their side. There's some. I have done that. But those bullies didn't have nuclear weapons. Those bullies didn't have an entire army behind them. Those bullies didn't have national pride that was standing in their way. And those bullies weren't looking at a situation that Vladimir Putin is looking at, which is potentially that if he stops winning territory, he stops living because their people will overthrow him, potentially. But don't worry, Russia's been a little bit busy as well. Hi, Jerry. Glad to have you on board. Had this reported to me multiple times in multiple places. I have not been able to find the original NOTAM message. Now, a NOTAM, or Notice to Air Missions, or Notice to Airmen, depending on how old you are, is a notification that goes to pilots of airplanes that tells them areas to avoid, particularly unusual situations, that type of thing. I've not been able to locate this NOTAM right here. But again, like I said, I've had it multiple places reported. Hi, Lucille. Glad to have you as well. Now, what's so important about this specific NOTAM? This is the area that was marked as off limits potentially from May 16th to May 26th because of Russian warships conducting rocket firing exercises right off the coast of San Diego. Now, they do state it's about 300 miles off the coast of San Diego, but that's well within range, and that's the problem here. So the message, I think, is pretty clear that Russia's trying to send without actually attacking the United States, and that is that they want to send the message that the U.S. better keep their nose out of it, or Russia will attack the United States. The problem is that Russia can't actually successfully take Ukraine in any type of reasonable time frame. So how are they going to attack the United States? Well, nuclear weapons. That's the implication. Everything comes back to nuclear weapons. But there might be more to it than that. For instance, here's Professor Mack. He's a former U.S. Navy veteran. There is no former U.S. Navy veteran. He's a U.S. Navy veteran. He's an atomic scientist, a physicist, and as he states, a mean old man. Let me go ahead and flip this over here. I just realized I wasn't showing you guys the NOTAM. Let me pop back over there. Here's San Diegoville showing that NOTAM notice here. Here is the closer view of that NOTAM notice from Reddit. Now back to Professor Mack here. Folks, it's time for a reality check, he says, the nuclear kind. First off, nuclear is my field across the spectrum, served, field of civilian, topic of mutually assured destruction, and Russia, he is well versed. Most of you know that the USA opened the floodgate when it actually used the first nuclear weapons back in World War II. Right or wrong, this is in the past, and the power of such weapons became a major focus of Soviet Russia. It was a source of power unmatched in the world at the time. From then until this very day, it is still a major focus of Russia and Russia's tyrant of a leader. Once Russia had nuclear weapons of their own, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became the system of balance that prevented nuclear war. And over the decades, Russia has repeatedly attempted to find a way around mutually assured destruction, which I will now refer to as MAD from here on out. First strike weapons, systems intended to prevent launch communications, everything they could do. The Cuban Missile Crisis was exactly just that type of incident where they were trying to find a way past mutually assured destruction by parking warheads 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Getting nuclear missiles close enough to the USA to destroy the majority of the U.S. nuclear missiles before the USA could respond and destroy Russia. To understand this a bit better, one has to recognize that Putin and Russia is only afraid of a U.S. response, not a U.S. first strike. This is because the U.S. does not want to use nuclear weapons and supports peace. Thus, the U.S. would not conduct a first strike. This gives Russia leverage in creating fear with threats of using nuclear weapons. That fear is then used to prevent the USA from responding to Russian expansion. And once again, we come back to the U.S. is not going to be the first strike people when it comes to nuclear weapons. We don't do that. We know what they do. We know what it costs. We know the entirely enormous costs in human capital and in the world. If we do so, we recognize what happens, because even though we were the first and the only ones to drop nuclear bombs in a war situation, This was before the actual understanding of all the potential effects was known. So we were working on it. We didn't know necessarily how the long-term effects would be. And it's been in the years since that we learned more and more and more about what would happen if a nuclear exchange actually happened. But Russia, again, is not concerned about the U.S. making that first strike. They don't expect that at all. What they expect is a response strike if they do, and they want to stop that strike from happening and thus take the power, seize control of the nuclear bomb power. That's what they want to do, to stop the U.S. from having an actual response. So I thought that was an interesting write-up by Professor Mack over here. Then we come to another item I wanted to address here. Nicholas Tinzer states 10 theses, or in a thread here. We are at war with Russia, not because we've declared it, but because it's waging a war on us. And they have been doing this hybrid warfare thing for a very long time. They've got their information operations down pat. They've got their psychological operations down pat. They've got their bots on Twitter. They've got their stooges on Facebook. They've got their producers on TikTok. They have got their people on Telegram and every other social media platform. They've got the more direct routes where they've got the direct relationships with individuals who will remain nameless because I don't know who their names are. But they have been working these information operations for longer than I've been alive. And they didn't stop just because the Soviet Union fell. But they've been ramping it up and ramping it up big. This is the war that Vladimir Putin is waging. And he fully expects it to become a kinetic war at some point in time. It's just a question on whether it will be at his terms or ours. From Republicans for Ukraine, they got this little bit from Senator Romney. I'll go ahead and play it and share it with you. Let me get this unmuted.
I find it hard to understand an argument that suggests that we would not stand with a sovereign nation, that we have committed to help support their sovereignty. We agreed to do that back in the 1990s when they gave up their nuclear weapons. For us to walk away from that and to walk away from the defense of freedom strikes me as being a very bad miscalculation on the part of our nation if we were to do that, in part because we do well in a world where there is freedom and democracy and where people can buy our goods and services. We've done well as a nation over the last 25, 30, 40 years, and walking away from like-minded people would be a mistake.
Well, you're on the Foreign Relations Committee. You watch these international events happening all the time. You're briefed by experts. I'm curious about your opinion here. There's an expected Russian offensive this summer. Are you concerned about how Ukraine might perform then?
Well, there's no question but that Ukraine is going up against a massive superpower. And is an underdog. There's no question about that. I think a lot of people, even in our own government, felt that Ukraine would collapse in the first few days of the Russian invasion. But they have performed extraordinarily well. Their leadership was strong. Their people were determined and courageous. And all they're asking for from us is the weaponry that in many respects we promised we'd provide. And it's in America's interest to see Vladimir Putin get the message. You can't invade your neighbors. And if you do invade, there'll be consequence. I can't tell you that the battlefield will be won by Ukraine, but I can tell you that if we were to shrink from providing support to a nation that wants to defend itself, then no nation in the world would believe us anymore. And Russia would invade their neighbor, another neighbor, Poland, a NATO nation. We'd be committed at that point to send in troops to help defend Poland, other NATO nations that Putin might invade. So keeping our own troops out of harm's way is a high priority.
Now, I do have, thank you very much, Salsa. I've just realized that myself, actually. So, yeah. Okay, so I got this quote from my mother. She emailed it over to me, and I think it very much applies at this point. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. That quote is from Elie Wiesel. Eleazar Elie Wiesel was a Romanian-born American writer, professor, political activist, Nobel laureate, and Holocaust survivor. So I always find it very interesting when I bump into these things because Mitt Romney in particular, I think he is fundamentally a good man at heart. He is a Republican, and I think that he's right on foreign policy. His domestic's a little bit more shaky, but when it comes to foreign policy, he knows what he's talking about. And he is basically expressing this exact same sentiment. There's a people that are suffering at the hands of an oppressor. And that becomes the center of the universe right then. Then there was this one. I tell you, I had so much stuff that I thought was really good for this intro, and each one of them would have made a great intro in its own right. But in each case, it's really fascinating here. Gorbachev, longtime Soviet leader, says, this whole thing about having NATO not accept new members was a myth. I mean, that's been the big marketing scheme, the big disinformation campaign from Russia, is this idea that NATO promised they wouldn't expand. And yet, I think this is in Russian here.
Warum es nicht vertraglich fixiert wurde, dass die NATO sich
It's in Russian, so I'll go ahead and mute that, but I'm going to play this and then read the text here. Today, people ask me why it wasn't fixed in a contract, that NATO must not expand eastwards. To do this, you should take the following into account. At that time, NATO and the Warsaw Pact existed. What should be stipulated in the contract? The question didn't even arise at the time. That means it's a myth that they were betrayed by the West regarding NATO's eastward expansion. Yes, that is actually a myth. Just before, okay, I think that's everything I wanted to address right there. Bloop. But Vladimir Putin's been all over talking about this NATO expansion being a problem. Then he tells Tucker Carlson, no, it was nothing to do with NATO expansion. He goes into history from 800 something, AD, talking about the Ruski Mir and all this kind of stuff. NATO expansion is an excuse, not a reason. It's one of their talking points and one of their disinformation campaigns. That simple. Then there was this address by President Zelensky. Our partners fear that Russia will lose this war. And then he continues to say, and they would like Ukraine to win in such a way that Russia does not lose. Then he expresses it a little bit more specifically. Their allies, as in the U.S. and the Europeans, fear Russia's loss in the war against Ukraine because it would involve unpredictable geopolitics. I don't think it works that way, he says. For Ukraine to win, we need to be given everything with which one can win. And another person expressed it this way. They want Ukraine to lose as slowly as possible. All for the fear of Russia collapsing. And that's just it. Russia has collapsed before. It's part of the landscape. We already know what happens when Russia collapses. Yes, there's a brief period of geopolitical uncertainty, but doggone it, look at where we are now. We are in a world loaded with geopolitical uncertainty. Having things going apart in Russia will not increase the amount of geopolitical uncertainty, not in the slightest. In fact, in a short time, it would likely reduce it. And that's where this concept of Russia not losing the war is so wrong. Or as Sergei Sumlini states, who is an Eastern Europe expert and founder of the European Resilience.org, Russians are Nazis, not neo-Nazis, not like the Nazis. No, they are Nazis 100% without any difference, without any modification. If you say you would have fought the Nazis in the 1940s, you need to fight Russians now. But what caused him to state this? Russian troops have executed a person in a wheelchair near a hospital in Vovchansk, according to the Kharkiv Regional Prosecutor's Office. The video, which I don't have here and I will not be playing, is brutal. Authorities suspect the victim was trying to move further away from the medical facility but was shot by Russian forces. And I want to just show you that article real quick just so you can see what I'm talking about. I see I managed to not get my switch over at time again. As you can tell, I'm a little bit passionate today. So bear with me as I get a few of these tech glitches taken care of. Or another way to look at this whole situation of the Russians and other countries being at war with the U.S. The American public may be done with terrorism after 2 decades at war, but the terrorists are not done with us. The enemy gets a say. Stay vigilant. That's right. Just because we aren't acknowledging that we're at war does not mean that we are not at war, because their enemies will be at war with us. From Tatiana Stanovaya, the founder and CEO of Our Politik and senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. In my recent piece in Foreign Affairs, I argue that nobody in Moscow is looking for an exit strategy from the war. Rather, people are prepared to fight as long as it takes. Many interpreted this as a thesis that Moscow will not negotiate with Ukraine or agree to a ceasefire. That is not what I was saying. And then she goes into some nuance here. It comes down to there's no discussion among senior officials in the Kremlin about negotiating with Ukraine or what compromises could be reached with Kyiv or the West. Decision-making on this issue is monopolized by Putin, and many senior officials simply guess what he wants. But Putin does not aim to storm Odessa, Kyiv, or even Kharkiv. First, he lacks the army for that. Second, he does not want to engage in large-scale battles. His strategy is to impose on Ukraine military pressure, diminish military infrastructure, and intimidate locals to coerce Kyiv into surrendering and accepting Russian demands. He will only take what he believes he can, given his limited military capacity, and wait for when Ukraine falls. And that is ironically the introduction for today's video. My heavens, that was a lot to go through. Let's go ahead and step on into Ukraine news. Ukraine news real quick here and talk about some of the things going on in the war and in the countries. By the way, if you have questions or comments, absolutely chime in. Let me know. I am very much animated today, so I do apologize if I get my hands waving around a little too much. Decorated Ukrainian pilot killed in action. From Ukraine's 831st Tactical Aviation Brigade. On May 18th, an experienced Ukrainian pilot, Denis Vasilek, had been killed in action. This was done recently during a combat mission. Usually that means they also lost the plane that's associated with that pilot. Russia continues to attack Kharkiv, mostly using glide bombs, which they can drop from outside of Ukraine's borders, especially on Kharkiv, which is not very far over the border. This one injured 5, including a couple of children, and there was a bunch of other damage. This is an early report, and I believe there were more since then. They also attacked more Ukrainian energy facilities overnight. They're expecting there will be more energy rationing to keep the lights on for everybody that needs it. On the plus side, though, Ukraine managed to down all 13 Russian drones overnight on the 17th. Now it is the 18th by now, so I'm catching a couple things over the last couple of days. And on top of that, now this is from Ukraine has actually put in their new mobilization law. It's come into effect. And part of that is they've digitized the whole registration process for getting in for the military service. 300,000 Ukrainians have registered in that new app, according to the Ministry of Defense. Pretty impressive. Russia has continued to attack other parts of the country here. Russian shelling of Odessa on May 18th killed one civilian and injured 8 others. You can see some of the consequences of that in this video. However, President Zelensky did state something that I thought was really interesting, and I'm not sure it's going to be borne out by the situation on the battlefield. He states, Ukrainian armed forces have enough artillery shells for the first time in years of war. According to him, none of the brigades are complaining about the lack of ammunition. Could be, and I do think they shook loose their stockpiles to try and deal with this Kharkiv offensive, in particular also to deal with the situation in Donetsk, and there may not be a lack of shells at the moment. I want to see more proof of that. This may be true, but it needs nuance, is what I'm trying to say. On the other hand, with the new law on mobilization going into effect, hundreds of truckers formed a blockade on the Odessa-Kiev highway in protest of the new law. They created a traffic jam, and they are going to be potentially, these truck drivers may be taken to the front lines. Now, I didn't get out the video for this one, but the May 18th today marks a mournful date. This is the 80th anniversary of the deportation of the Crimean Tatar people. This genocide claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people and deprived the Crimean Tatars of their native land. So a sobering anniversary. Now, I've talked many times about the creativity of Ukrainian armed forces. Now they've got some of these 9K33M OSA SAM systems that normally take the 9M33 canisterized missiles. They've modified one to take R-73 air-to-air missiles and launch those instead. That's one way to get your air defense needs taken care of. Interesting and fun at the same time, even in a war zone. Now the situation out of Russia, and I've got a lot of stuff in Russia, so I'll be breezing through a lot of this stuff here, trying to keep you informed. During a recent Storm Shadow strike on occupied Crimea, a secret air defense base was struck, killing its commanders, with Russian channels confirming the death. A reason I point this out is not because to talk about this man's death, but to say that it's clear that Ukraine's intelligence is very, very good if they can strike this secret base and kill its commander with a Storm Shadow missile strike. Really interesting. The latest defense intelligence update from the Ministry of Defense of the UK. On the 14th of May, 2024, attacks on Belbek Airfield. We've already talked about this several times. They're talking about the consequences. Number one, this is the 4th time in the last month that the Russian air defense in Crimea has suffered losses. In this case, that looks like the SA-21 air defense missile battery was destroyed, including the radar and launchers, and at least 2 MiG-31BM Foxhound Cs were destroyed on the ground. Other reports include several other damaged aircraft and some other similar systems. But it's clear that with this constant pressure on Russia, they are making real dents in Russia's ability to bring their aircraft to the battlefield. And this cumulative effect of these strikes has seen an overall degradation in the ability of Russia to defend the airspace around Crimea, while simultaneously demonstrating Ukraine's ability to impact Russian air defense operations. They say that it's highly likely that Russia will have to disperse their air assets to ensure survivability or risk losing more aircraft while having to relocate their air defenses from elsewhere. So every air defense system that gets destroyed in Crimea or Ukraine, it's one less air defense system that Russia has for the border with NATO, the border with China, the border with Japan, well, not exactly border, but that island that they're disputing over there. They've been stripping air defenses from every other area in order to keep air defenses going in Ukraine. And let me tell you, if they were really scared about NATO marching over their border, they wouldn't be redeploying those air assets into Crimea or Ukraine at all. They'd be beefing up those borders right now. There was an explosion at the St. Petersburg Academy, and the Russians claim, now initially they said it was drones, but the Russians have come out since and said it was a piece of World War II ammunition that exploded instead. Take your pick on what you believe on that one. I don't have good information beyond that, but this is one situation where I actually believe the Russians are probably right. It wouldn't surprise me if a piece of unstable ordnance was found and resulted in that damage. Russia's Tuapse oil refinery in Krasnodar Krai was forced to shut down following a Ukrainian drone attack on May 17th. Now, this one, I believe they didn't hit the cracking unit or whatever that's called. They hit another facility there, but that's forced this refinery to shut down. By the way, the building that was damaged in St. Petersburg was a military communications academy. Interesting. At least 7 Russians were reported injured. This one, I think I've got a video around here somewhere, so bear with me. I'm going to see if I can find it real fast. Here it is. Okay. This is from the Russian city of Novorossiysk, and this is footage from local citizens documenting several explosions at the oil depot with strong secondary explosions. With these, they said the UAVs just kept on coming. The reports are that there was 80 drones used in this attack. There's one passing close overhead. You can hear it. This attack went all night long. I mean, just kept going, and the hits just kept on coming. They actually stated that there was like lines of drones flying through the air coming to Novorossiysk and striking the port facilities and the oil storage facilities. All this stuff happening in Novorossiysk, which is, by the way, purely Russian territory. Sources within the special services have told the Kiev Post that the Security Service of Ukraine and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense are behind that massive drone attack on Russian regions. It was a very hot night for Russian military logistics facilities located in Crimea and on the Russian Black Sea coast. Explosions in Sevastopol Bay, where they had an electrical substation causing power outages. In fact, they said there was fires going on all night. They confirmed the oil refiner in Tuapse was struck. And this is the second time on that particular facility, which the Russians had just begun restoring. This shows that Russia's having trouble with their air defenses. Where air defense at, as they like to say. But this is a simply massive strike on that port depot. And I found it particularly interesting because there is this Novorossiysk is where the bulk of the Russian fleet is now, including their submarines that launch Caliber cruise missiles. Now, the Caliber cruise missile launching submarines, and I think I've got this later, I'll show it to you if it comes up, but normally when they're in port, they have the sub all the way surfaced. You can see about half the top of the hull and the conning tower and the sail and all that kind of stuff. Those submarines are currently sitting with just the top of their conning towers showing. Their bridge is right there because they are concerned about being attacked in port by Ukrainian drones and missiles. That's how effective this is getting. Now, this is an interesting little poll, I'll say it. Most Russians support ending the war, but only if Putin keeps the occupied territories. This is the typical thing with Russia. They don't want to lose. They want to end the war. They're tired of their people dying, but they want to keep what they stole. Strange how that works. By the way, this is more on that drone strike. This one reports over 100 drones were used to target the Krasnodar oil refinery and port. Now, this is from Belbek Airfield. Again, some of this stuff got mixed around because, I've got a limited amount of time to do the research these days. They published these new satellite images. This was fuel storage, as I understand, at the Belbek airfield. You can see also some of the other pictures show things like destroyed airplanes and equipment. The damage is extensive, and it's clear that the Ukrainians knew exactly what to strike. The thing is that the fuel storage is actually far more vital than the planes themselves, because by destroying the fuel storage, they make it so Russia has to truck in more fuel, putting pressure on their ability to refine more fuel, causing them to have to redirect more of their refining capacity from making fuel for tanks, causing them to have to make more jet fuel to come to the front. And then they don't have anywhere to store it, so they have to truck it in, and then they have to use those fuel trucks to fuel those planes, making the operation tremendously less efficient. The destruction of the airplanes is the expensive part. The destruction of the fuel means that the Russians will have to be spending days and weeks to try and recover the logistics behind this. Novorossiysk, there was actually an electrical substation that went on fire with 20,000 city residents that were left without power. More on those drones. Like I said, this is a well-reported item here. But this came from earlier today, literally this afternoon. Explosions in Perevalny, where the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade of the Black Sea Fleet is based. So there's another round of attacks going on tonight as well. We'll have to watch what those are in the next report. This is the bit about the submarines I mentioned there. You can see them just barely sticking above the water, just a little bit at all. Shows only, as they call it, the deck houses of these submarines in the harbor waters. And they're not exactly tied up to the dock as well. So this one might be, but that one's kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. This is just to protect these launchers. Now, the U.S. has done their analysis of Ukraine strikes on Russian infrastructure. The destruction has been primarily in their oil refining capacity, not in their power system, although they have set some electrical systems as well. Now, with all the tourists, bailing out of Crimea as fast as possible. Now, understand, all the tourists, this is literally tourism season in Crimea right now. They're at the start of summer. They should be getting huge amounts of visitors. But wine sales in Crimea have fallen by 3 times due to the outflow of tourists. That tells you that those Russians are not looking at Crimea as their vacation spot right now, but just one more way they could end up dead. A factory in St. Petersburg. This is actually a factory here that is going up in smoke. This was today, not the communications college that I mentioned before. But this is yet another item in St. Petersburg that's also going up in smoke. We're waiting on further reports on this one. I talked about this kind of in the intro. From Jay in Kiev. Now, Jay is very much a hyper-partisan pro-Ukraine individual. I don't hold that against him, but he does point out that Putin must now be in a constant state of territorial expansion, continuously gaining territories for the remainder of his lifetime. If at any point he begins losing territories, Russians will likely oust him in a bloody way. That means that Russians are hooked on their wartime economy. More information on the hit on Novorossiysk. This is from yesterday. But finally, we'll end off with a large group of Russian warships have left the Russian base in Tartus, Syria, and are heading north of Portugal, probably on their way to the Baltics. There's been quite a bit of discussion about a little bit of a war breaking out in the Baltics, some kind of provocation. And the Russians are working on it. So that's likely why we're seeing signs of these ships relocating potentially to the Baltics to try and arrange something to cause more trouble. Let's go ahead and move on to the international situation here. Not as much today in this one, although I've got plenty still. We've talked about Olaf Scholz and his unwillingness to send Taurus missiles and a few other things like that. And it's clear that he has aggressively avoided sending it for a variety of reasons. However, he's starting to get some pressure. Now it's even within his own party that they're talking about situations like this. And now they're even talking about possibly closing the airspace over Western Ukraine to help Ukraine out. So that is, I think they're going to see a lot more pressure on Germany to do something a little bit more direct. Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter, I'm not going to bother pronouncing that because I'll butcher it, says he has vetoed the Council of Europe's decision to recognize and support a peace formula to end the war in Ukraine proposed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Hungary has been a thorn in the side. This is a real problem. They are being a real problem. By doing this, they're effectively supporting Russia. Now, you can make the case that they don't want money being spent on Ukraine that could be spent instead on Hungary. And that is a likely valid interpretation. But still, the end result is still that they're supporting Russia in the end. Stephen says the Baltics are feeling uncomfortable for the Russians. 2 new NATO members there. Yes, indeed. And it looks like the West is actually starting to move equipment and set up air bases in those areas to try and make sure they're there if anything kicks off in a bad way. So thank you very much for that, Stephen. You are absolutely correct. Danone has announced the sale of its business in Russia to a company from Tatarstan. This is a French company that's finally sold off their assets. There's been a bunch of, shall we say, troublesome companies that have remained in Russia for longer than they are necessarily welcome. In fact, 2 of them found that their assets were entirely confiscated just in the last 24 hours, both financial institutions. So I think I've got that in here, and if we do, we'll come to that. But if they don't sell it off and take the loss now, it gets seized by the Russian state. That's how they're making their money right now. They got to do something. Moving over to Georgia for just a moment. The Georgian president, we already talked about that controversial foreign agents law that's patterned after something Russia wanted. Well, the Georgian president finally delivered her veto. Now, the odds are the parliament is going to override that veto, but this is good news. It means that the Georgian citizens who want to be closer to Europe and not closer to Russia have somebody fighting on their side. So she vetoed it. She couldn't have any other options. Their constitution, their laws don't allow her to let it molder on her desk. She either signs it or it goes into law automatically, much like the U.S. system. Sign, veto, or let it just go into law without your signature. Microsoft began disconnecting Russian corporate users from its cloud products. They've got a list. They've been working on this for a while, so it's no surprise here. But overall, the fact that it's finally taking place is a good sign that Russia may have finally stepped over the limit for many of these Western companies. I already talked about that earlier. Oh, yes, here it is about the Russia is now just robbing foreign companies for liquidity. They demanded IKEA pay $140 million for some fabricated tax penalty. And today they seized 463 million euros from Unicredit. They're just robbing the piggy banks now. Anything they can to get money. This one, though, I don't know how I feel about this one just yet. China has again refused Putin's request for the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline project. The construction of the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline is postponed, with Russia and China not yet agreeing on key details of the project. A new contract with Beijing is desperately needed by Gazprom, which lost its European market and lost more than half of its exports after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They've been meeting over this, trying to get this project put together for some time. The thing is that Russia doesn't have anywhere to send its natural gas to if it's cut off from going to Europe. So, well, the next best option is to send it to China. And I think China is looking this over and thinking, no, not yet. I don't need the gas that bad. And if I wait longer, Russia gets even more desperate because this whole meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, Well, Putin kind of looked like a lost puppy through it. He was very much looking very cowed and not able to really take control of the meetings, at least from what I was seeing. So he might be feeling the heat and realizing that he's now turned Russia into a vassal state of China. And finally, on the international front, Germany plans to spend 15 billion euros on military aid to Ukraine next year, which is a record amount. Of course, that means that they're expecting the war to go another year. And that's the international side. Now, we've got stuff out of the front lines. Kharkiv's relatively stable right now. So we'll get that. We've got that kind of put together on the end. There's a bunch of interesting things that are still going on. Let's dive into it. The Ukrainians claim that they have shot down another Su-25 jet attacker. That's good for them because the Su-25s are very good at their jobs, and having them shot down is a better situation for Ukraine. Now let's take a brief look at the deep state map, which has got today's updates. Get that out of the way. There is a report, at least on this side, and I believe this is a couple days delayed, that the Russians have taken Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region here and advanced in Netilova, which is over near Avdiivka, as I recall. Yep, outside of Avdiivka. This is this finger sticking out. Looks like it's pointing at something now. And reported some partial success in the south of Novomikhailivka, and the others are just updates. So not a lot of changes to the front lines. There is one spot I want to point out, though, that's from yesterday. Look at the situation in Robotyne. This is all now gray zone. I've got information on this later, but this update happened yesterday. There's a lot of situation going on here. We'll discuss it in just a moment. In fact, here it is. Russian sources claim that Russia has captured the village of Robotyne with geolocated footage showing a Russian presence in the center of the village, but the Ukrainian troops said they've since driven the Russians back out, so they expanded the gray zone. We don't know the current status of Robotyne. It's basically a flattened field at this point in time, full of rocks and rubble. It's still being fought over. A Russian armored assault near Chasiv Yar was basically entirely destroyed. This is just really hammered these guys. It was a combination of artillery and drones, and this is one of the indications that we're seeing that the shell hunger is being satisfied at this point in time. Now let's talk about for the Institute for the Study of War for a little bit. They talk about Kharkiv. I've kind of wanted to put this a little bit in later, but it also works here just fine because there's a bunch of stuff here. Russian President Vladimir Putin framed the Russian offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast as part of Russia's efforts to create a buffer zone. This is because there's those Freedom of Russia Legion and those Russian partisans have been just having a field day over there in Belgorod, marching in there whenever they want, causing havoc, and they're hoping to create a buffer zone. What prevents them from marching right through the buffer zone, they don't say, but welcome to the Ukraine war. They do report, or at least Zelensky reports, that the Ukrainian forces have stabilized the front in northern Kharkiv, and that the Russians have not reached Ukraine's concrete and most powerful line of defense in the area. I'd say that's a mixed bag. Russian forces will likely be able to stretch Ukrainian forces along a wide front and fix Ukrainian troops in the international border area, even as the tempo of Russian offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast slows down. Yes, the purpose of this is to widen the front, fix more Ukrainian forces now in this new area, and basically they're trying to utilize Russia's manpower advantage to their advantage, instead of just throw meat at everything. Russian forces reportedly leveraged notable electronic warfare capabilities to support tactically significant gains during the first days of their limited offensive operation in northern Kharkiv Oblast. I believe I've got more on this, or at least I think it's there. I want to talk about this for just a moment, though, because information came in that on the first day of the Kharkiv part of this invasion, Starlink went down and drones lost contact. Everything, all their communications in that area, dead. And this went back and forth for a bit. Was it Starlink shutting things down, or was something else going on? But the further information they've gathered since then indicates that it was a broad spectrum jamming. Now, that type of thing takes a lot of power. I mean, if you're going to jam a large number of frequencies, a large broad area of spectrum, you got to put a lot of juice in there to do it from anything but the closest of range. So they must have brought an electronic warfare system and juiced it up majorly to cause this kind of a widespread, large, broad spectrum jamming situation. Otherwise, if you can't get enough power there to really jam anything except on the local level. Really interesting, and we'll be looking to see if there's more information on what Russians used to do this. Netilova, this is from a couple of days ago. Russia advanced into some open areas there. This has now been confirmed, so they've updated the maps. This is the assault on Chasiv Yar being absolutely repelled. It's 2 minutes 20 seconds. If you want to watch it, it's a whole lot of Russian armor getting its butt handed to it. Here's the link. I just put it in the comments. And we've been watching Sumy pretty carefully. The Russians pulled up a couple of tanks in the Kursk region right near the border with Sumy. But the Ukrainians noticed, and they immediately attacked with drones, destroying the 2 tanks. So they almost started or set up something to happen, thinking that they were going to be safe on the Russian side of the border, but the Ukrainians got a vote in the matter. Now let's talk about Kharkiv. We have got a lot. Here's the bit about Starlink. This is where they were initially blaming Starlink for it. The overall situation looks like things have relatively stabilized, with the Ukrainian defense lines in Vovchansk and Lipsy seeming to have been strengthened, with new troops arriving and Ukrainians resisting in force. So this is good news from Ukraine's side. There was a push. The Ukrainian military pushed near Halibok, which I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation too. So they are working on counterattacking the Russian forces at this point in time, at least in small-scale individual actions. From the outskirts of Vovchansk, Kharkiv, the Ukrainian forces hit a concentration of Russian infantry on the outskirts of town there. This is an ongoing combat, but the real thing that pops up as probably the most important piece is an airstrike on the Vovchansk City Hospital. Now, this was performed by Ukrainian forces. They'd already evacuated the hospitals when this hospital, when the Russians came into the area, pulled all the patients and the staff out, pulled themselves out, and abandoned the hospital. The Russians, when they get to Vovchansk, move in. And here's a video of that attack. You can kind of see the distinctive buildings here. That's important because it narrows this down quite a bit. So let me pause this here because I don't want it running like that. Here's Vovchansk. This right here is the central hospital. There's several other hospitals listed here, but this is the central hospital. You can see the building arrangements right here. So that means the Russians managed to push into the village or city itself. This is definitely a city area. It looks like their intention is to try and capture all the territory north of the river here, this water feature. But, of course, when they moved into this central hospital, the Ukrainians decided to pay them a little visit with an airstrike. Now, that's different than a drone strike. That means they were using bombs or whatever they were using on their aircraft. They were carrying out that type of airstrike right up to the front lines. So Ukrainian forces are definitely active in that regard. Here's another view of the exploding hospital. Now, Jason J. Smart does say that he thought there were hundreds or even thousands of Russian soldiers in there. Other numbers have been a lot more reserved about this, 20 to 30 to 40. There's no official numbers on what was lost in here, though we have seen reports that it was part of the TikTok brigade, the Kadarovites that were in there that were using that building. Rustam Agwev's Akhmatovites, and they state that 25 to 30 people died. That's from Supernova Plus. Now, the Russians do report they took control of the village of Staritsa in Kharkov region. Cadaver writes, Ozzy, thank you. That was great. Love it. The Russian army reports that they've taken control of Staritsa, Kharkiv region. The Ukrainians haven't commented on that. Let's go see if we can find that real quick on the map here. I found it earlier. Staritsa is right over here. They've already reported that the Russians have taken Birovatka, but their Staritsa is just in a gray zone. There's not much there. It's a tiny little village, but the Ukrainians and Russians have been fighting over every tiny village. So we don't know the status of Staritsa tonight, but it could be in Russian hands. Of course, the Russians certainly didn't waste any time. They've already started looting the place of toilets and washing machines and everything else and hauling them out of the zone. As soon as they got into the edges of Vovchansk on the north end, they started looting the place. Lovely. And this is what Vovchansk looks like today, with the city, much of it in fire and smoke and similar situations. You can see the river right here. And the overall situation means that it's a battle zone right there. As Anton Herashchenko states, Russia swallows up lives, cities, turning everything into nothing. Overall, this Kharkiv offensive has resulted in an addition of 70 kilometers to the front lines. This is already an enormous front line. 70 additional kilometers is not enormous, but it does spread Ukrainian forces even more thin. Though you can never think that it's enough for Russia's propagandists. Here is Dmitry Medvedev. If it continues like this, the guaranteed sanitary zone, or buffer zone they talk about, will be somewhere at the border with Poland, or in Poland itself. Right. And that's everything about the front lines. I'm going to go ahead and bop into some extras here. Let me take a look at what I've got on this. Oh yeah, I've already talked about that. I will talk about that at the end. So we've got a little bit of extra here, mostly related to the Ukraine war, but some not. This one here, I'm going to summarize it because this man shared this story, and I wanted to share it with you, but I've not gotten permission to share the full story here. And he has not contacted me about potentially voicing this for me. Short summary. He talks about him being a young officer in Afghanistan and fighting because he thought their national survival, etc. This is his story of how he became jaded. And he talks about in Afghanistan, he had this female lieutenant that reported to him, tall, beautiful, all the whole 9 yards. And one day he notices that she's talking to a couple of Afghani women who are in their full covering. And shortly after, he sees that lieutenant with her helmet off, sitting on the ground crying. And so he came over and asked why she was crying, and she said, "They just asked me if I could buy them from their husband and take them back to America with me." Now, Cynical Publius, I don't know his name, stated that that was the moment that he realized, how can we expect to civilize these people? How can we expect to make a modern republic or even a democracy when we are here with people who are still effectively engaged in slavery, who are still so backward in their beliefs, in their practices? How could we think that we could, in a few years' time, create a functioning democracy in Afghanistan? That it was our own hubris in this matter. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to read this. I've put the link in the comments. I do encourage you to read this because it is very well written and not that long of a read. You can be done in 2 minutes. But this is the type of enemy we end up facing in the end. We think we understand, and yet we do not. Because we don't think like them. Our first thought is not, how many bodies do I have to throw at this to win? Our first thought is, what's the cost? Our first thought is not, how many people do I have to die? I don't care how many there are, just throw them all in there. That's what we face. We face slavery. We face wickedness. We face this evil in the world. And yet, if we did nothing, that would be accepting the evil. Moving on, before I start the waterworks over here, this is from a couple of days ago. 2 people inside a box truck tried to force their way onto Quantico Marine Corps base. Multiple sources report one of the individuals inside the truck is a Jordanian foreign national who recently crossed the southern border into the U.S., and that one of the occupants is on the terror watch list. We've got a real problem here in this country. And our enemies, once again, a reminder that we are at war because our enemies are at war with us. And they want to hurt us. And they want to kill us. And they want to destroy us. And that's not going to go away if we keep ignoring the problem. Okay, this one is a little bit more, less intense. We'll just put it that way. Russian T-80, the soldiers film that's burning in the background there. You can see the full-on turret toss. Oh, my heavens. Quite the impressive. Obviously, Russians are absolutely the best at the turret toss, and they will never lose to a Western tank. That is for sure. The power of companionship. How about that little dog with that soldier? Super cute. I got a couple of more items here that are not directly war related. So if you are only here for the Ukraine war, now's a good time to bail out. But I do appreciate you being here. Hit me with that old thumbs up. If you want to stay, there's only about 3 more items. I think we'll be done in 5 minutes. But just understand, I appreciate you being here and want to tell you how much I believe that the war in Ukraine is vitally important to stopping the bullies in the world, to throwing back the dictators. Stop them there and stop them hard. And dictators the world over will start rethinking exactly how important that few extra yards of territory are to them. So one of the problems we always bump into is deep fakes. And they're getting really good these days. They're hard to detect, and you have to watch what you see. And I wanted to share, I'm going to share the video here with you, again, in the comments. So you can see this and watch it at your leisure. Not going to share it that way. But they use this example of a video that I thought was really good for a casual view. But it wasn't until she expressed what was wrong with it, the blinking was weird and the facial movements were a little off, that I realized, oh, that was a deep fake. And from Ivana Strodner, the same script everywhere, smearing campaigns to silence you, and the best way to discredit you is to portray you as a nationalist and twist the facts, which is an old KGB game. Now, this is talking about Lulia Mindel, who was attacked by Russians for being a nationalist, by nationalists for not being nationalist enough, by Zelensky's opposition for being his former press secretary, and by some bots for not being pro-Zelensky. And as she says, just keep going, girl. Ivana says, just ignore it and write even more now. Don't let them intimidate you. Understand that, to a certain extent, The opposition you may be facing may be artificial, may be inspired by Satan, or maybe just a Russian disinformation operation in effect. Keep that in mind. Pay attention to your principles. And always make sure you confirm information from trustworthy sources as best you can. And if not, you better be thinking about it real hard before you start sharing just random things. There are things going on outside of Ukraine and Gaza, though. There are dictators across the world that have been emboldened. Over in Myanmar, there is a small city of 55,000 being razed to the ground, burnt, displacing those people. These dictators are across the world. They just love having a United States that's not doing what it had promised to do. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate you being here. And if you have any comments or questions for me, absolutely ask. I would be glad to hear them. I will have a video on some of the latest with the presidential elections coming out soon, that Biden and Trump have accepted the terms for a debate and have deliberately written them in a way that would exclude RFK Jr., except for one minor detail, which means that they may be hoisted on their own petard if anybody bothers to look at the rules. But that will be releasing probably tomorrow because I'm finishing the editing tonight. And on that note, you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.